All right, so this is going to be our play pause it video for week 4. I'm going to try to keep this one, brief like I did the other one. I don't want to make this a full hour. I know nobody wants to watch me talk for an hour, and it kind of sucks that we can't really have active participation and everything. But I saw a lot of your feedback on my first video, and I'm going to try when I upload this video to play pause it to kind of make it a little bit more interactive. I think that was kind of, a big thing that you guys wanted to see, which, I totally understand. And I think, I'm going to try, like I said, to embed some questions about the stuff that I'm talking about just to kind of test your understanding as we go through this. So I'm also only going to look at this in terms of completion. So if you watch the video from start to finish, that's perfectly good. You'll get the full credit for the assignment. But the questions will be there kind of for you guys to test your own knowledge of the information. And, if you're not really understanding, feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to explain this one-on-one, and make it a little bit easier for you guys to understand. But so in this video, we're going to talk about 2 of the sociological paradigms that we did not get to in class. So those 2 sociological paradigms that I'm going to mention in this video are symbolic interactionism, okay, and social constructionism. Okay, and so symbolic interactionism, I already kind of told you guys last week, that's going to be a micro-sociological theory, okay, because it examines the influence that individuals themselves have on their societies at large. Okay, so we're looking at individual behaviors, and we're looking at how those behaviors and individual interactions kind of contribute to the whole of society. Okay, that's what symbolic interactionism does, and we're going to explore some of the theorists associated with symbolic interactionism in a little bit. So also we're going to talk in this video about social constructionism. Okay, this is that one paradigm I told you guys kind of fits into both macro and micro sociology. And that's because it really just depends on the context, and I'll go through that too. There's not much you really have to know about social constructionism. It's kind of intuitive when you see it on the test. But I just want to point out, that it exists. I'll kind of give you guys little tips about, when you should select an answer choice that, might pertain to social constructionism, and what kind of wording and questions might tip you off that they're looking for social constructionism specifically. So I'm going to make another video that's going to be optional where I kind of wrap up all of the sociological terms and all the sociological paradigms that we talked about. But briefly, I just want to go through, mention structural functionalism again. So remember, we said structural functionalism last week was a macro theory, okay? And it conceptualizes society as a living organism with many different and interrelated parts. So this was that whole theory that I told you guys about, that you can kind of think of society as an organism. You can think of society containing vital organs and stuff like that are necessary to keep it alive. Okay, and I want you guys to mainly associate structural functionalism with Emile Durkheim. Okay, and also this concept of social facts. This is what Emile Durkheim kind of brought into the world with his sociological theories. So he said that these social facts kind of dictated how individuals kind of behave, and those social facts were kind of made up and fabricated by society. They're not set in stone anywhere, but they really drive the behavior of individuals. Okay. So we talked about Durkheim, we talked about this guy, Herbert Spencer. Like I said, you don't really need to know much about Herbert Spencer. Just know, that Herbert Spencer kind of coined this term structural functionalism. He was kind of the pioneer of structural functionalism, if you will. Okay. So that was really the gist of structural functionalism that we talked about in last class. We also talked about conflict theory, which we said was the other macro theory. And remember, top down is the same thing as macro. So top down really just means that we're looking at the big society and how the society, influences the behavior of each individual that live in it. Okay. So conflict theory, we said that it's kind of just like a constant fight, a constant class struggle that exists in society. So Karl Marx, I told you guys, was super important for this one. We talked a little bit about Marx's theory here. And then we also talked about this guy, Max Weber, who's going to come up again when we talk about symbolic interactionism in a second. So if you guys remember from last week, I kind of told you guys that Max Weber is like the guy from the Muppets. He's like the guy that sits up in the rafter in the Muppets. At least that's how I think about him. Okay, because he's not really completely involved with any of these sociological paradigms. He kind of just like critiques everything. He just like sitting up at the top of the theater, just kind of talking shit. Not necessarily talking shit, but he's just kind of like like throwing his 2 cents in, and kind of just critiquing the theories as they exist, and, modifying them to how he sees fit. And we're going to see, how something that Weber kind of thought, one of his kind of ideologies, was kind of the genesis and the impetus to create this symbolic interactionist movement. Okay. But before we get into that, I want to just give you guys a little broad definition of symbolic interactionism, just like I did for conflict theory, and for structural functionalism. So, symbolic interactionism, I want you guys to think of, individuals, I'm going to say influencing and shaping their worlds through various uses of symbols or something like that. Oh, oops. Okay, so, that was kind of a messy definition, but I'm going to explain what I mean by this now. So symbolic interactionism is really, really concerned with individuals, okay? And not necessarily always individuals, like one person at a time. But, when I say bottom-up theory or a micro theory, we're examining how small group interactions, how many multiple small group interactions kind of culminate in making society a certain way. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily have to be the behavior of one individual that influences society, but all of these micro theories kind of, they explore ways that small groups and small one-on-one or two-on-one or whatever interactions contribute to how society is as a whole. Because when you kind of amalgamate all of these different one small group interactions, that's going to determine the trajectory of society. At least that's how symbolic interactionists think. Okay. So, like I said before about this guy, Max Weber, he kind of threw his 2 cents in here too. So I'm going to talk about what Max Weber said that kind of laid the groundwork for this symbolic interactionist theory. And so although, you can think of Max Weber when you think of conflict theory a little bit, Max Weber was really kind of a proponent of this idea that individuals act according to the meaning of their world. So, Max Weber was kind of one of those people who said at first that symbols were largely, I'm going to write this down, symbols were influential in determining, individual behaviors or something like that. Okay, so really all Max Weber said, he kind of gave out this theory that symbols were super important for determining how individuals or how small groups kind of dynamics go. Okay. And Max Weber, like I said, wasn't necessarily a symbolic interactionist, but this idea kind of laid the framework for symbolic interactionism as a sociological paradigm. Okay. The main guy who I want you to think of when you think of symbolic interactionism, we're going to talk about this guy a lot right now, is this guy, George Herbert Mead. Okay, so George Herbert Mead is super, super important for symbolic interactionism. He's kind of the biggest symbolic interactionist that you're going to need to know for the MCAT. Okay, and Mead was interested in identity and the development of this concept that he called the self. Okay, and I'm going to put self in quotation marks like that because this is actually something that George Herbert Mead kind of made up. So George Herbert Mead had his own theory about how all of our identities are formed. Okay, and that kind of also contributed to how we think about symbolic interactionism, even in a contemporary sense. So George Herbert Mead was very, very influential for symbolic interactionism as a whole. And we're going to talk about his theory of the self because that comes up time and time again on the MCAT. So I just want to make sure that I explain that to you guys when we talk about symbolic interactionism here. Okay. So basically, I'm going to put all the stuff about George Herbert Mead in a bullet point over here. And there's going to be a lot of bullet points, but just know that everything, below this is pertaining to George Herbert Mead. Okay. So first I want to just give you guys a broad definition of what the self is. Let me put that again in quotation marks so you guys know this was really his kind of term. Okay. So your self, according to Mead, was your identity that emerges emerges from external social interactions and I'm going to put and in all caps because it's important to know that the self comes from external social interactions and also through from internal feelings. Okay, so Mead said that this idea of yourself was kind of how you perceive who you are. So it was kind of like, you're developing your own identity. And Mead said that your identity was developed through your interactions with others, but also from internal feelings that you hold about yourself. Okay, so we're going to talk about the self a lot right now. So I want to tell you guys kind of how does the self, or let me put it here, how does the self develop? Okay, so again, like I said, everything that's under here is what George Herbert Mead said. Okay, so just know that like this might actually be BS. Like I said to you guys about all this stuff up here with Karl Marx and even with all this stuff up here with Durkheim and the social facts. This is just what this guy thought, and it's important to know what this guy thought because the MCAT, there's a lot of questions about how did this guy think or what did this guy think. So what George Herbert Mead thought about the self is that it develops through three processes. Okay, so three important processes kind of determine yourself. Okay, so I'm going to write them down now. So we have language, and I'm going to define them all too. Language, play, and games. Okay, we're going to go through each of these right now. Okay, so just know, that Mead said that the self develops through language, through play, and also through games, okay? So this is where it starts to get a bit complicated because sometimes the MCAT will ask you to identify, what, they'll give you like an example, like an anecdotal example of something, and they'll be like, okay, what part of the self-development or self-acquisition theory does this pertain to? So I'm going to go through each of these. Language is probably the most straightforward, so we'll start with that one. Okay, so language, is probably the most potent example that we can all think of using symbols in order to communicate. If you think about it, all languages really just use sound. We make, sounds with our mouths and when we combine different, phonemes and all that stuff together. We'll talk about language theories later when we get into more social psychology stuff. But language is really just symbols that we use to communicate, okay? So words are symbols, right? So, I could think of the word computer, right? If I were to just say the word computer to you, everybody thinks about a computer in their heads, okay? So language is really just a bunch of symbols that we use to represent things in our lives, that represent things that we use to represent things that we do. Language is really the most potent example of how we use symbols, okay? So the self can be kind of, developed through language, according to George Herbert Mead. He said that the way that we speak and the things that we say determine how we feel about who we are, okay? So language, I'm going to say, articulate abstract concepts, not even necessarily abstract or just articulates concepts. Okay, it doesn't have to be an abstract concept, right? Computer isn't necessarily an abstract concept. We all just know what a computer is. When you hear the word, you think about a computer in your head, okay? Articulates concepts symbolically, okay? And like I said, the reason that it's symbolically is because language is literally just a bunch of symbols, okay? We're just using a bunch of symbols to represent and kind of describe the things around us, okay? So the self can be developed through language. That's number one. Okay, so next we have play. Okay, there's play and there's games. This is where it starts to get tricky because you have to kind of be able to differentiate what George Herbert Mead meant by play and what he meant by games. So I'm going to give you guys some examples too. Okay, so play, Mead kind of described play as any activity which can be categorized by spontaneity or freedom. Okay, so that word spontaneity, okay? Spontaneity, when I think of the word spontaneity, I think of spontaneous, right? Spontaneous kind of just means will of the moment, kind of just if you have a friend who's spontaneous, right? They might just randomly drop a bunch of money to go on a trip or something like that. Or they might, be randomly willing to go drink with you at a bar or something like that. That's somebody who's spontaneous. So play is really any activity which can be categorized by spontaneity. So anything that's kind of spur of the moment, fulfillment or anything that you're kind of doing for personal pleasure, okay, or freedom. And I'll explain to you what I mean by that in a second. But let me give you guys some examples of play. So I'm going to go even further over this way with the bullets, okay? So when I think of the term play, okay, according to George Herbert Mead, I think of two kids kind of playing around in a sandbox, okay? We might imagine that we have two kids playing in a sandbox, okay? There's no rules when you play in a sandbox, okay? They're not necessarily playing a game. They're just playing around with the sand in the sandbox, maybe building some sandcastles, maybe throwing some sand at each other, maybe digging a hole to China, whatever they're doing, okay? It's all, low stakes. They're free to do whatever they want while they're engaging in the play, okay? So think of, two kids in a sandbox. Okay, so that's one example. Another example could be like when you go meet your friend at Starbucks or something like that. That's an example of what George Herbert Mead said was play, okay? Because you're not going to Starbucks and like talking to your friend, whatever you're talking about, right? Like your friend's not going to be like, oh, I got to tell you all about the vacation I just went on. Like come chill with me at the coffee shop and I'll tell you. And then, when you're done having the conversation, your friend doesn't like turn to you and say like, okay, time for the test. Like hope you brought your pencil and your graphing calculator because you have a test on everything I just told you, right? No, that's not play, okay? You're not doing that. Whenever you hang out with your friends, you're not getting tested on what they told you, okay? You're going to hang out with your friends because you want to, because it's an activity that you derive pleasure from, and because it's an activity that, you're doing spontaneously and freely, okay, at your own whim. All right, so, meeting a friend at Starbucks. Okay, that was just an example, I'm thinking of now. So basically just think about play in the sense that George Herbert Mead said that play is anything that you engage in, any activity that you engage in that is, characterized by this freedom where there's no stakes. You're not going to like win or lose. You're not going to like, you don't need to do this to survive. It's just something that you want to do, something that you're like trying to do just for fun and for personal pleasure. Okay. So this is how we define games, okay? So games are different from play in the sense that they have much higher stakes, okay? Games have much higher stakes than play, okay? They also might have a set of rules associated with them, okay? So this is how you can differentiate play from games, okay? All of this is according to George Herbert Mead. He said that play was any activity where there's nothing going on. You're not getting the test from your friend at Starbucks. You're not required to build the biggest sandcastle in the sandbox. You're just playing around. You're just doing whatever you want, okay? Games are different, okay? When I think of games, according to George Herbert Mead, I might think of like a game of Monopoly, okay? If you're playing the board game Monopoly with people, right? There's winners, there's losers, there's a set of rules to follow, right? You got to play the game properly or you're not going to be able to win, okay? A lot of things that we do throughout our lives are actually, according to George Herbert Mead, games, okay? Another example, taking the MCAT, that's a game. Okay, there's rules and there's rewards given to the winners. Okay, same thing with Monopoly. If you win Monopoly, you get bragging rights over your family or whoever you're playing with, right? If you're gambling or something at a casino, right, your payoff is going to be your reward. Okay, and same thing with the MCAT. You can study for the MCAT. That's going to be a game that you play in your life, according to George Herbert Mead. That game is going to result in rewards, okay? So you'll be rewarded with a good score if you study hard, okay? So all three of these things, language, play, and games, were three things that George Herbert Mead said contributed to, this concept of self and how we develop our self, okay? And remember, I said that our self is our self-identity. So it emerges from how we interact with other people and from the internal feelings that we have about ourselves. Okay, and we develop this sense of self from language, play, and games. Okay, also right up here, make sure that you write up here, so not born with self. Okay, so this concept of self, according to Mead, is not something that you're born with, okay? It's something that you acquire after you interact with people and then internalize feelings about those interactions. So you're not developed, your self is not developed until you've done each of these things to a decent extent. Okay, so all three of these things, language, play, and games, just know that these are all three things that contribute to the development of the self. Okay, but it gets even more complicated than this. Okay, so, I'm going to try my best to explain this, in a way that I remember it. It might not be the best explanation. Like I said, if you guys still need help with that, feel free to reach out. But we just talked about how the self develops. Okay. But so there's actually two components, or there's multiple components of the self, according to George Herbert Mead. So we talked about, like I said, we talked about how the self develops. So now, different components of the self. Okay, so there's some different components of the self that we need to talk about. Okay, I'm going to list them out now, and then we're going to talk about each of them. Okay, so we have the me, the I, and the generalized other. Okay, so the generalized other, I'm going to put all of these in quotation marks because these are all things that kind of Mead made up. So if you ever see me, I, generalized other, these are all terms that you want to associate with George Herbert Mead's theory of the self, okay? Don't get them confused with the id, the ego, the superego that Freud talked about. These are different. This is, something that pertains specifically to George Herbert Mead. So we'll go through each of these. And like I said, I have a specific way that I remember these, and I'm going to share it with you guys. So hopefully it'll kind of help you out a little bit too. So when I differentiate from the I and the me, so these are two different components of the self, right? The I and the me. When I'm differentiating between these, I think of them in grammatical terms, okay? So think about it like this. I is a pronoun, okay? In the English language, this word I is a pronoun, okay? This word me is also a pronoun in the English language, okay? So we have two pronouns here, okay? So again, like I've said time and time again, and like we're going to see time and time again with Psych Soc, if you don't understand what a concept is when you look at it on the test, just think about other places that you may have heard that concept. So this is what I would do. If I didn't remember what the different components of the self were when I was taking my test, I would think to myself, okay, what are these words? Me and I. They're pronouns, okay? One of them is a direct object pronoun, and one of them is a subject pronoun, okay? Which one of these is the direct object pronoun, I or me, okay? So the answer here is that me is the direct object, okay? So me is a direct object, okay? And that means I is a subject pronoun, okay? Direct object pronoun. Okay, and this is why I remember it like this, because I'll show you how identifying that these are subject and direct object pronouns kind of helps us figure out what the I and the me actually represent in terms of the self. Okay, so when I think of a sentence, sorry, I just accidentally clicked on something on my computer. Hopefully it doesn't pop up. Okay, so when I write a sentence, I'm going to write a sentence here. Okay, I'm going to say I punched him. Okay, so this is my sentence. This is a very simple sentence. We only have 3 words, okay? There's a subject, a verb, and a direct object in this sentence, okay? Let's take a look at it. So what's our subject? Our subject here is I. Our verb is punched, and our direct object is him, okay? So let's talk about the me, the direct object pronoun in this theory of the self, in terms of a simple sentence, okay? So in this sentence, what is him? So if you look at this word him, okay, this is the direct object. It's receiving the action of the verb, okay? So him is being punched, okay? It's receiving my punch. Let me actually, I'm going to change this to a name so it's simpler. So let me say I punched Michael, okay? The biochem instructor, Michael. Let's pretend I'm punching Michael. So our direct object now is Michael, okay? So Michael is the direct object here. It's receiving the punch, okay? So Michael is receiving my punch, okay? And that's just how we can think of this concept of the me, okay? Direct object pronoun receives the action of the verb. And the reason that this is important is because since me is the direct object, it's the component of our identity that is receiving the interpretation and analysis from other people, okay? Receives the interpretation and analysis from other people. And this may seem confusing now, but I'm going to show you guys a chart in a second where I kind of go through this a little bit more. So think about me. Me is the direct object pronoun, and it's receiving the action of the verb, okay? So your me, which is a component of the self, okay? Your me aspect of yourself is that part of your identity that is kind of, influenced by other people's interpretations of you. So it's your part of your identity that gets influenced by other people saying stuff to you or about you, okay? That's what your me is, all right? Your I, okay, if we look again at this sentence, I punched Michael. I is the subject here, okay? And when you think about a subject, right, that's the one that's doing the action of the verb, okay? So, in this example, I am punching, so I is the subject pronoun here. So I represents, the part of yourself, that acts on others. So part of your identity that acts on others. Okay, so Mead said that the I was the component of your identity that sort of acts on other people. And it's kind of the part of your identity that you hold true, that you think about yourself, that you project to others. Okay, so I might have my own internalized set of opinions about who I am. And my I is like what I project to other people about those ideas that I have about myself. The me is the part of your identity that when you hear people talk about you or when you hear people talk to you a certain way, you internalize that, you're receiving the action of other people, and that kind of influences how you think about yourself and how you think about your identity, okay? So I'm going to show you guys a chart in a second that will hopefully clear that up. But like I said, the easiest way to differentiate the me and the I here is to think about this simple sentence, okay? I is the subject. I is who I think I am. And the idea of who I think I am is projected toward other people. Me is what other people think about me that I internalize about my own identity. Okay, and there's one other thing here called the generalized other, okay? And the generalized other, Mead just said, was an organized and generalized attitude posed by a group that an individual uses to frame his or her own conduct. So let me just write that. So an organized, generalized, okay, comma, attitude posed by a group that an individual uses to frame their own conduct, okay? And that's kind of a weird definition, but let me explain to you guys with this chart what that means. So this is a lot more clear of a representation of what we're looking at here, okay? So this is the self. George Herbert Mead said that we have three different components to the self: the me, the I, and the generalized other, okay? The me is the part of the self that you think about from other people. So when other people say stuff about you, when other people criticize you, you internalize other people's opinions, and that's your me, okay? Your I is kind of what you think about yourself, what you showcase to other people. So those are both components of yourself. And then this generalized other is the attitudes, the viewpoints, and the expectations that society has on you that influence your me, okay? So remember, the generalized other influences your me, and then both your I and your me work together to form your entire self concept, okay? So if you guys want to kind of copy this chart down, I think that would probably be super useful because this is a really good kind of representation of it. So just remember, like I said, I'll say it one more time. So, because this is important. So your self is made up of three components: I, me, generalized other, okay? Your I is what you project to other people. You project your own kind of internal opinions about yourself to other people. Your me is all of the criticism and all of the things that you hear about yourself from other people that you internalize into your own identity. And your generalized other just represents the people who are influencing you, the people who are influencing your me. Okay? So hopefully that makes sense. This is a really tough concept to talk about because it's kind of complicated. But you know, like I said, really you can break this down by thinking about it sentence wise. Me is the direct object and I is the subject. Okay. So that's really all I wanted to talk about with George Herbert Mead. I know it was kind of a lot, but there is one other guy that I want to talk about with regard to symbolic interactionism. Okay, so there's one more guy here, and he's the last symbolic interactionist we're going to talk about, and his name is Erving Goffman. Okay, and some of you might have remembered Erving Goffman from, the winter break work. So when you think of Erving Goffman, I want you to think of the dramaturgical approach. Okay, so the dramaturgical approach was kind of this approach that Goffman kind of made up. So it's, kind of like a subset of symbolic interactionism. So it kind of falls within symbolic interactionism. And so dramaturgical approach, I'm going to give a little definition of it. So Goffman viewed, this sounds really stupid, but this is just what he thought. So Goffman viewed individuals as actors on the stage of life. Okay, so he kind of thought that life was all like a play. Okay, so what Goffman said was that people in society have different faces that they project to other people. So they project to different people. Okay, and so depending on where you are in society and depending on kind of what you're doing, you might project a different face that you kind of have in your arsenal. That's what Erving Goffman said, and he said that society at large was influenced by all of these people who were showcasing different faces of themselves at different times. Okay, so I'm just going to write that real quick. So, people showcase different faces at different times. So I'll explain to you guys too what a face means. So for example, so just from a personal standpoint, okay, I have a specific face when I teach this class. Okay, I have a specific face. I have to act like a teacher, somewhat, whatever. I have to, be, somewhat professional. I have to be somewhat, whatever it is. If you guys met me at a bar, you would see a completely different face, okay? I wouldn't be acting the way that I'm acting right now. I would be acting completely differently, but it's still me. I'm just projecting a different face in a different situation, okay? I have another, different face when I teach my high school class, okay? When I teach chemistry to 11th graders, I have a different face than when I teach you guys, okay? I can't, be as nonchalant when I teach the chemistry kids. I have to be a lot more careful about what I say because, I can't be accidentally slipping curse words in my lectures. That's not really appropriate for that age. Or, I guess it is, but, the high school doesn't think so. So I have different faces depending on what I'm doing, and everybody does. And that's what Erving Goffman's kind of idea of this dramaturgical approach was, that society is shaped by all of these people having different faces, in different situations throughout their lives. Okay. So that's really all you need to know about Goffman. And that's really, honestly, all you need to know about symbolic interactionism. So just know that symbolic interactionism largely deals with individuals influencing and shaping their worlds through uses of symbols. That's super important. Okay, and the main guy you want to associate with this is Mead. Okay, know all about Mead's idea of the self. Okay, we said that the self develops through these things, and that these are the different components of the self. Okay, and then we talked a little bit about Goffman. All you need to know about Goffman is that he coined this term dramaturgical approach, and he viewed individuals as actors with different faces depending on which situation they're in. Okay. All right. So the last theory that I want to talk about before I end this video, and I don't really have much to say about social constructionism because there really isn't a lot to say about it. It does come up a decent amount on the MCAT, but like I said, it's pretty intuitive when this is the answer to a question you're looking at. You'll pretty much be able to tell, and I'll give you guys some specific things or some specific kind of things that should tip you off that, okay, we're talking about social constructionism here in this specific question or something like that. Okay, so social constructionism kind of holds that individuals actively shape their entire reality through the use of symbols. Okay, so social constructionism says that individuals shape their worlds literally through the use of symbols. And that sounds very similar to our definition for symbolic interactionism, right? So we're still talking about individuals shaping their reality through the use of symbols, okay? But social constructionists kind of think that every single thing is symbolic and that nothing is real at all, okay? Like I said, this one you'll be able to usually clarify when you see it in an answer choice, because the answer always involves something that's like made fully by society or something like that. So symbolic interactionists also believe that individuals shape their own reality. So like we said, symbolic interactionists agree with social constructionists in that regard, but social constructionism is much more extreme. So you can think of much more extreme form of symbolic interactionism. All right, and I'll explain that in a second. But before we do that, I want to talk about what a social construct is. Okay, so a social construct. All right, a social construct is basically something that doesn't actually exist in reality, but so something that doesn't exist in reality, okay, but exists because we assign meaning to it. Okay, and then there's some examples we can talk about here. Okay, so, social constructs are all those things that don't necessarily mean anything, but like because of human interaction and because of the way that we, operate in our societies, we kind of assign arbitrary value to those things. Okay, so for example, money. Huge social construct according to social constructionists. I'm going to put everything on the same line so we're not taking up too much space. So money is a social construct according to social constructionists because it's literally just pieces of paper and pieces of metal, right? But we've assigned that money value in our society. It really holds no significance at all. But we've assigned it value, okay? So there's some other things that social constructionists kind of think are social constructs, okay? Gender is another thing that social constructionists might deem to be a social construct, okay? Race, okay? Class, all right? Even age. Some social constructionists even argue that age is a social construct, okay? So think about, when you're thinking about what social constructs might be, just think about all the things in society that we assign meaning and value to that we kind of made up. So obviously, with like gender and age and race and all this stuff, there are, like phenotypic differences between males and females, right? But this concept of gender, according to social constructionists, is something that is completely just made up by humans. So just know that like there can be even things like these that social constructionists will say is a total social construct. Okay, and so like I said, you'll be able to identify when the answer to a question is social constructionism because the passage will probably be about money. And then the question will be like, this philosopher, they'll be like, X philosopher thinks that, money holds no significance in society and that it only exists because we assign meaning to it. That would be social constructionism. All right. So think about it that way. And then also remember that this can be either macro or micro. Okay. Depending on the context. Okay, and what I mean by that is that we can either look at this top down or bottom up, depending on the context. We could say that there's social constructs at the societal level, just like money, that shape the way that people behave. So people are really, really trying to get money their entire lives, right? And that's because we have this money as a social construct that exists and kind of drives forward our society and drives what individuals do in our society, okay? And then gender, you could think of that in terms of macro or micro. Okay. So, there's systemic oppression of any groups, that goes on at the macro level or at the micro level, right? So you could have sort of, oppression based on what social constructionists think are social constructs, at the micro or at the macro level. It completely depends on what we're talking about. Okay. So like I said, social constructionists really are concerned, with all of things like this being social constructs, and all of these social constructs kind of, drive how society operates. They kind of drive how society functions and stuff like that. Okay. So those are the two sociological paradigms that I wanted to talk about in this video. Hopefully that helped clear them up a little bit. Like I said, I'm going to make an optional video where I go through structural functionalism again, conflict theory, symbolic interactionism, and also social constructionism again. But hopefully you guys like this video, and I will see you guys in class tomorrow, or whenever you're watching this video, I'll see you in class on Sunday.